Hello, good evening. My father was a baker. More specifically, he was a pastry confectioner. He specialised in icing cakes and making beautiful gateaux. So at Christmas time, his life was rather busy. Excuse me. At home, however, it was always my mother that did the cooking. Well, except on very rare, very special occasions. And her cooking was good, including her Christmas cakes. Rich fruit cake, plenty of brandy, lashings of marzipan, I'm very fond of marzipan, and lots of royal icing. My mother had two favourite designs for her Christmas cakes, and they tended to be indicative of the way her preparations for Christmas were going. If she was feeling fraught and all the jobs were getting a bit much, the Christmas cake design would be a snow scene. You've probably done a snow scene. Nearly everyone has. They're nice and easy. You put a lot of royal icing on the top of the marzipan, and then you flick up the icing with a fork, and then you have some little commercially bought novelty figures. These days, plastic. In my youth, probably plaster of Paris, that you dot around on the top. A little reindeer or a snowman or robins or something like that. And then you do the sides by buying or making a paper frill. They look pretty and it tastes fine. If my mother's preparations for Christmas were going smoothly and she was feeling calm about things, then we would have a more formal design on the top of the cake, one that was piped, and usually it would be a star. And my mother's stars always emphasised the Jewish nature of the event. Not because my mother particularly cared the fact that Christ's child was a Jew, but because the Star of David, which has 6 points, is a lot easier to draw than the Bethlehem star, which has 5 points. Most people can manage a 6-pointed star, but a 5-pointed star is a lot trickier. That leads me on to my first story about Christmas lights. And no, I don't mean the tangle of wire and LEDs that were working fine when you took them off the tree one year and never seemed to want to work at all when you go to put them on the tree the next year. The particular lights that I'm talking about on this occasion was a Star of David. I would have been about 7, and my dancing school always did a Christmas concert. And this was the first year that I had a solo spot in the Christmas concert and wanted it to be very splendid. I was very proud. I was going to sing a song called The Old Lamp Lighter of Long, Long Ago. I'm sorry to admit I can't remember anything about the words of the song and not the faintest idea what the tune was like. But I do remember the title, and I do remember my outfit. My outfit was to be little green dungarees and a wee willy winky pom-pom hat, and I had a lantern to carry, the lantern attached to a pole. All of the costume was made, apart from one vital part to the design. My dancing school teacher required that the bib of my dungarees should have emblazoned upon it a 5-pointed Star of Bethlehem in gold-coloured sequins. Now, my mum, as I've just said, was only ever good at doing the Star of David, 6 points. My dad, very good at the Star of Bethlehem, or any other sort of star for that matter, was unfortunately ill. During the Second World War, he'd been stationed in French North Africa, and while he was there, he'd contracted something called sandfly fever. It's not unlike malaria, but not nearly, I think, so serious. But it does tend to recur in bouts from time to time for a long while after you've actually recovered from it. My father was having one of his bouts of sandfly fever. The date of the concert was getting nearer and nearer, and my mother had tried doing some 5-pointed stars on tracing paper before putting anything onto the costume, but they'd not been very successful. So in the end, she threw sympathy to the winds and nagged my poor dad to wake up, get up, and design and put onto my dungarees the 5-pointed star, which, with a little bit of grumbling, he did. And then, having got involved in doing it, he decided, since he'd drawn the star on the dungarees, he'd put all the sequins on as well. And by the time he'd finished that, he decided, well, surprisingly, he'd recovered. I went to thank him for my 5-pointed star. I was very much a daddy's girl, and I thanked him for doing a lovely star on my costume, especially when you were so very poorly. And he said, bravely, "Oh, don't worry, darling. I wasn't as poorly as all that. It was only sandfly fever." And I said, "Oh, no, it wasn't." "What do you mean?" he said. And I replied, "I told Nana, and Nana said you didn't have sandfly fever. You had something much worse." "What did I have that was much worse?" he said. And I said solemnly, "Idolitis." I don't know what happened after that. I didn't know that idolitis was a made-up word to do with wanting to stay snug in bed on a cold day. Never mind. I had my costume. I haven't got a picture of me in the costume. I've got a picture of me rehearsing the show and in my dancing school rehearsal costume with my lantern. So I know that it happened, but the star that shone so brightly has unfortunately vanished over the years. But it does lead me tidily on to my next story. And my next story was about the only time that I was ever in a pantomime. Now, I went to an all-girls school in my secondary school years, which gave me plenty of opportunity to dance and to sing and to be in public performances and plays. But I always seemed to be cast as a boy, and I did want to be cast on one occasion as a girl. And this, unfortunately, was not the occasion. Because on this occasion, I actually wanted to be the boy. There's something very splendid about being principal boy in a pantomime. But was I the principal boy? Oh, no, I was not. I did have a female part. I was cast as the Wicked Witch. The pantomime in question was called The Tinderbox Man, not one of the front runners of the pantomime stories, and the Wicked Witch had one big important scene. For some reason, which has long since escaped me, she had to make a spell, and the spell was about the moon rising, and the rays of the moon falling on a gnarled old tree, and carved into the bark of the tree was the secret sign or symbol which led one to the treasure. I had a spell, and the spell was all rhyming couplets. And it came to my scene, and there I was, with my pointed hat and my crooked nose and my haggardy fingernails, and I did my little spell for the moon to rise and light on the tree. Unfortunately, I was only just into the spell when I realised the spell was not going to be very effective. The moon was not going to rise. Why not? Because the moon was affected by a follow spot, which was on the balcony at the back of our school hall. And the lighting operator of the said follow spot was my best mate, Jennifer, who was sitting, thoroughly enjoying the pantomime, in the front row of the audience. She didn't have many lighting cues, and had decided that until it was her moment, she would sit and enjoy the show. Well, that's fair enough, except when it was her moment, she was still enjoying the show. I made up couplet after couplet. "Oh, dear moon, why shine so bright? If you don't, I'll be in a plight." They were the sort of couplets that I made up as I went along, and I glared at her and hoped that by some power of mind I would actually get through to her that there was a crisis. And that worked, except that when it did work, it didn't happen subtly. She suddenly went, "Oh!" and jumped to her feet and pounded across the front of the front row and out of the door at the front of the hall and down the corridor at the side of the hall and up the stairs at the back of the hall, and she had on good, sensible shoes on our school's good parquet floor, and so every single footfall was audible to the rest of the audience. And she arrived at the follow spot, which of course wasn't switched on, while I was still ad-libbing like mad with the longest spell ever. Now, if you've ever operated a follow spot, which you probably haven't, before you switch it on, you have to make sure that the aperture is very small. And you also have to make sure that there is a screen across the aperture of gauze, so that when the light comes on, it comes on small in size and hazy. And then when you know it's in the right place, you open the aperture and you bring up the intensity of the light. Well, that's what should happen, but in her panic, my friend Jennifer just flicked the switch to on, and the light came on full blaze in completely the wrong place on the stage, and so she frantically whizzed it round, and it looked for all the world like the sort of spotlights that went on to aeroplanes in the Second World War when they were trying to pick them up. It wasn't subtle at all. Eventually, the light fell upon the exotic symbol carved on the tree. And when it did, there was tremendous applause. But for her, the technician, not for aspiring poet, me. Oh dear. Of course the spell worked, because the rest of the pantomime wouldn't have carried on otherwise. Christmas lights, they've always been a problem. I'll tell you another Christmas story on another day. Bye-bye.